Okay, so I'm down at Western Illinois University, drove up last night, and I'm very happy to be here. If any of you are looking for a great place to go to school, whether you are young or old, right now I have a student that's farmed for 43 years. I can't tell you how awesome that is to have that interaction with the younger students. I have another older student, only mid-30s, so not too old, but he won the Illinois Corn Yield Contest. He came back from service in the military, and he's also in one of my classes. It's a fantastic thing to have a mix of experiences in a class. I want to just very quickly go through some resources. You know, when you hear the story that Gary was sharing, sometimes you need to just sit back and try and process it. And I think some of these resources that I'm going to go through just real quickly will be very helpful as you try to process the concepts of crop rotation. How many of you are familiar with this publication? Okay, not very many hands. This is a great publication. Let me just show you the chapters. It just goes step by step, not just for grain crops, but it's actually a very interesting mix of horticultural crops as well as grain crops as well as perennial crops, and some excellent, very science-based, accessible information on how to think through designing a crop rotation. It's on the SARE website. It's available for free or a very inexpensive hard copy purchase. Another great publication from the SARE website. Anybody familiar with this one? Building Soils Better Crops. So this is the 3rd edition, and they're actually working on the 4th edition right now, which will contain some really new, interesting information about, some of the kind of cutting-edge things about using multi-species cover crop mixes and new ideas on how we build organic matter. Gary mentioned, how simple compounds can feed microbes and turn into complicated compounds. We used to think plant biomass just gradually broke down and whatever was left was the organic matter. Now we think that organic matter is primarily built up from little compounds turning into microbial compounds, and that's what actually accumulates in the soil. So some of that stuff will be in the new edition of Building Crops for Better Soils, but there's a great discussion of crop rotation, including one of these interesting ideas about how we don't actually want our organic matter levels to be constant. We want cycles of organic building, and then the digestion that Gary was talking about, and then building back up again. Those are the types of things that are discussed very well in this publication. Okay. You can't talk about crop rotation without thinking about a business plan, because the number one driver really needs to be your markets. Do you have a market? You can think of all sorts of amazing crop rotations without a market. They have to fit a market. But at the same time, the market shouldn't be the only driver. Okay. There's also lots of interesting scientific literature. This is a great publication out of England, and you could see that heading there, crop rotations, the central management tool in organic farming. I completely agree. We also have lots of great research being done in the United States. Out of Iowa State, they have done some really good work on how adding diversity improves all sorts of things. Agronomics, better weed control, less need for inputs, and of course also improves profitability. Okay, what I want to go through real quickly is something that some of you have maybe seen me talk about before. I think in my experience, working in the organic industry, the most fulfilling part is interacting with all of you that are doing the successful things that are unique for each of you, but you each have your context that as I think about it, as I try to figure out what can I teach about how to do organic successfully, I look for the themes, the commonalities across the successful producers. And here are some of the things that I think are the common context. And what we really want to think about in terms of a crop rotation presentation is how crop rotation fits into this context. So obviously, people who are successful in any type of entrepreneurial activity, they have a strong focus on financial management with, of course, good marketing being maybe the foundation of that, but only part of financial management. What I tell people that ask about, well, you know, do you really believe in everything that organic is all about, all those rules and, you know, all that stuff that sometimes doesn't seem completely science-based? And I'm honest, I say that sometimes I wrestle with some aspects of organic, but I see organic as the system that really is the only well-established system that will reward you for longer rotations, that will reward you for soil building. And so that's why we need to capture those premium prices, so that we are paid to do a better job, so that we are paid to do those things that are so difficult to do in the conventional world. We need to focus on cropping system solutions, and that's what I see as a common theme across the successful producers. Strategic selection of crop and cover crop sequences. I actually don't use the word crop rotation that much. I think more about sequencing. What are we trying to achieve in terms of one thing preceding or one thing following? A rotation implies that it just goes around and around. And I think that's too static. We need rotations that evolve rather than revolve. But they need to be evolving, driven by not just financial goals, but also cropping system solution goals. Okay? We need to use a technology effectively. If you take a look at the successful producers, some of them are very technology intensive, and they're using the latest, you know, GPS, GIS information, precision organic, and other people simply use older technology, but they use it very effectively through proactive maintenance, adjustment, and upgrading. Okay? We should all be open to new technology, but we have to figure out how it fits within our human resources. You have to have people that are good at technology if you're using certain types of technology that maybe you're not so fluent in. Maybe you need a younger generation on the farm to help you with that. Okay. People who are successful start right. They just know how important it is to establish a good stand. Now, there are other aspects of starting right than establishing a good stand, but I think when I tell my students you need to come to class because you need to plant a good stand, what I'm telling them is all the other things that you could do afterwards will not be effective if you don't start out with a good stand, right? And so we need to think about how crop rotations are preparing us for establishing a good stand. What comes before needs to not impede the next crop, but rather facilitate the next crop. And you can see some of the things I think about. You can look at the very bottom, planting deeper and later. That's something that obviously not everybody does, but that to me is a common theme across most of the most successful organic farmers. Okay. Effective residue management, preventing nitrogen tie-up. Gary talked about that a lot. So important in terms of thinking about sequencing. What comes before should not create problems that will be difficult to deal with when you're managing your next crop. Timeliness of field operations, especially weed control. Labor allocation is a very important aspect of crop sequencing or crop rotation. If you have too many things going on at one time, if you are only growing corn or only growing corn and beans, everything is getting stacked on top of itself, and it is very difficult to get everything done, particularly with the importance of field operations in organics. And so spreading out your crops in terms of winter annual crops, summer annual crops, perennials, annuals, that really helps with this timeliness. Farming system flexibility. This is the evolve rather than revolve. We need to have systems that can react to whatever our new information is, whatever the new drivers are. We need to have systems that are forgiving. Maybe we need livestock to eat our mistakes. Maybe we really need to have some additional labor or equipment available that we don't use all the time. You take a look at what organic farmers have in their toolbox. They have a lot of tools, even if they're not using them all the time. Okay, and then just to kind of wrap up this story of success: excellent observation skills and attention to detail, prioritize problem solving, lifelong learning and self-examination, and strong support system. So obviously this wasn't, what we just went through was not just about crop rotation or crop sequencing, but this is the context for putting together a crop sequence that's going to work for you. How many of you feel like you have a really strong support system? I think in organics, you are faced with challenges that you would give up if you didn't, if it was just you having to make those tough decisions. Maybe not all of you, but many of you, without the person or the people, the community, you would not be able to persevere. And so it really is so important to think about that support system. But that's also part of how we make decisions about our crop sequences. Do we have somebody who can do one activity while we're doing another activity? That helps decide what we should be doing. Okay, so overall we have this complicated context for success in organics, and rotation or sequencing is one piece of this. The geographic spread of fields is not something that I have to deal with very much. I have a research farm where everything is contiguous, 70 acres, but when I talk to the larger organic grain producers that have this spread of fields, it's something that I realize is so important in how they make decisions. And so you have to figure out how scale of enterprise and spread of enterprise is a driver for you, but it's going to be very different if you have things spread out or have very large-scale enterprises. Okay, so my specific context is Western Illinois. We've been renting this farm now since the early 90s. We do about 70 acres of crops, mostly large-scale experiments. What's critical to make what we do work is we have great people, lots of good student workers, but also Andy Clayton is my technician, and some of you have met him before. He's instrumental in making things work. But also our collaboration. When I think about our support system, our area farmers that are conventional farmers are very much part of our support system. We collaborate with them in that we rent their equipment, but we go talk to them when we need troubleshooting, and they are not necessarily ever going to do what we're doing, but they really are interested in what we're doing, and that is so helpful to have farmers that are watching our fields, not with an adversarial perspective, but watching our fields thinking, okay, when I talk to Joel next, this is what I'm going to suggest. Okay, so how do we choose our crop and cover crop sequences? As an educator, I try to think about first principles, okay? And so I'm not going to read through these, but these are the types of principles that are described in some of the earlier publications that I mentioned, okay? And we definitely think about these types of things, what we are trying to alternate, what we want to have going back and forth, whether it be deep and shallow root systems, nitrogen fixing, nitrogen demanding, those types of things. So definitely I'm thinking about these things. I'm also trying to think about what does the National Organic Standard require. Now this is not a really important driver for me, but as an educator I want to think about, am I doing things that really fulfill both the letter and the spirit of the law? And I don't know if you have thought, or maybe I should ask, how many of you have actually read either this or any significant amount of the organic standards? Okay, I need to read more of it, okay? As I was putting this together, I realized I had not read these words for a long time, okay? But the bottom line is that it doesn't say that you have to have a certain number of crops in rotation. There's no language that says that you can't grow corn after corn specifically. But it does say that you have to have a crop rotation that includes things like sod, cover crops, green manure crops, and catch crops that provide the following functions and it says maintain or improve organic matter content, provide for pest management in annual and perennial crops, manage deficient or excess plant nutrients, provide erosion control. What this means is this is something that the certifier has to evaluate when you propose the crop rotation on your farm plan. When you say, I want to grow just corn, a corn bean rotation, their job is to ask you, are you achieving these functions? And your job is to make the argument that you are, if that's the rotation that you want to use. And then, of course, there's supposed to be a follow-up process where they are actually asking for some quantitative indicators, perhaps. You know, can we see your soil test levels? You know, is your weed management improving rather than spiraling out of control? This obviously depends on high-quality staff working for the certifier. It's going to vary between certifiers. But the point is that there is not a very specific definition of crops or numbers of crops that have to be in rotation. There's the guidance that you need to have a rotation that achieves these functions. Okay? What we have here is actually one certifier's approach. I'll just confide this. I talked to MOSA, that's our certifier, and I asked them, so what do you do when an organic farmer, you know, someone who wants to get certified says, I want to grow a very simple crop rotation, whether it be a continuous sequence of crop, a single crop, or just corn and beans. And this is the language, this is kind of the boilerplate language that they use when they are responding, and they modify it for the particular situation. But basically, they push back and say, well, it's not the specific number of crops or type of crops, but rather the functions that we are concerned you're not achieving. You're saying that you want to grow just corn and soybeans, but there's indication that you are putting on too much manure because you're putting it on every other year, or that you're not controlling weeds effectively, or you're not controlling erosion effectively. Okay, so one key question I had as they were telling me this, you know, it was just sounding all theoretical. I said, is this a real situation? Do you have a lot of farmers? Can you confide in me that you have a lot of farmers that are requesting these very simple rotations? And they said that, yes, it's a significant issue. Every year they're dealing with this, and that they interact actually with other certifiers to talk about this challenge of how to address basically the request by farmers. I want to grow only my most profitable crops back to back. Why don't you let me do that? Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so when they interact with other certifiers, what I learned yesterday actually was there is an association of accredited certifiers, and they get together and they discuss how to deal with the sticky issues of certification. And so they're working on a document right now. This is just kind of a consolidation of it, and there are lots of details that I left out, but these are 7 questions that basically it's recommended that certifiers ask when a farmer wants to use a rotation that is a very simple rotation. And we can just take a look there. For example, are practices used which increase or maintain organic matter content? Is monitoring done? Are pests and weeds controlled adequately? I won't read any more of that, but some of you, particularly if you are thinking about how you can justify keeping these less profitable crops in your rotation, be ready to think through these types of questions, because a good certifier should be asking you, are you achieving the desired functions of a rotation? Okay, so what are my specific priorities? When I'm putting together our crop rotations at our research farm, maybe first and foremost, I'm trying to solve agronomic problems. And I would say weed control is the #1 issue that I'm thinking about as I put together a sequence of crops. I'm trying to enhance soil health, and a key part of that, I'm trying to reduce tillage frequency and intensity, and I want a crop rotation that will allow me to do that. I'm trying to offset inputs. I don't want to buy in all of my nitrogen, for example. So I want to have a rotation that perhaps is using 50% of the nitrogen that I think is needed for my crop coming in from a purchased input, and the other 50% supplied through cover crops and other nitrogen fixing species. Logistical efficiency. Anybody who's operating on any scale knows what I'm talking about here. We want to have unit tractor trailer loads of grain leaving the farm if possible. So I'm thinking about how to design that. We want to have unit tractor trailer loads of chicken litter arriving at the farm. So I try to design for that. We want to have, when we're applying a product, we want it to basically work well for a full round of the field. We don't want to have to, have a rate that we run out in the middle of the field. All sorts of logistical issues are the key things that help me decide what kind of crop mix I should have, what kind of crop sequencing I should have. Labor allocation is also important for me. It's obviously a little different if I'm thinking about using student labor or hiring custom work done by our neighboring farmers, but we all have labor allocation questions, and those questions really can be a very important driver in terms of your crop sequence and crop rotation. Okay, so weed pressure, as I said, is one of the #1 issues that I'm trying to address with crop sequencing, and I won't read through all of this detail, but there are some specific things that I try to think about. For example, seed longevity. Certain types of seeds basically last forever. So like velvet leaf, once those seeds are in the soil, even an extended crop rotation, 5, 6, 7 years, you're not going to have the velvet leaf just exhaust itself in that amount of time. But something like foxtail only survives a few years in the soil. So if you can eliminate foxtail seed rain, foxtail seed production for just a couple years, you can dramatically reduce foxtail pressure in your fields. Fallow periods. That's something that I have kind of been forced into thinking about recently, but I actually really think that we should embrace this concept more seriously. It's hard to do if you don't have any grazing animals to go out of a harvested grain crop, but by necessity, I've had a few seasons. Last season, for example, we planted a sunflower crop in the middle of a very dry period. We planted as deep as we could, and we still only had about 50% emergence. And that's planted, about 3 inches deep. So we ended up having that particular field end up as a fallow field. Now, it wasn't bare fallow. There was a short, about a several week period where it was bare fallow, but we planted the sunflowers, and then we decided to fortify that mix with a bunch of other species once we decided that it wasn't going to end up as a cash crop. I'll just mention sunflowers real quick. We really like sunflowers agronomically. We've really struggled with marketing them. And so we would have them in our rotation in every field if possible if we had a good market for them. But we like them also as a non-harvested species in a cover crop mix. And so we are working on that. One thing that, of course, you need to be concerned about is your cover crop going to go to seed and become a weed problem? And so I'm working on some ideas there. There are sterile sunflowers that are used for, male sterility is used for breeding sunflowers, hybrid sunflowers. And so I think there may be some options for having some cover crop sunflowers that actually aren't going to produce seed. The other option, of course, is just to plant them late enough that they are killed by frost before they produce seed. Another just real quick comment on fallow. We have had a lot of success with no-till organic soybeans, but we also have had some failures. And we had a failure 2 years ago. we decided to pull the plug. It would have been great if we could have grazed some animals on that beautiful mix of, rank soybean biomass and also tall water hemp and foxtail and other weeds. But we decided just to till it in, and it probably wasn't quite as digestible as what Gary was promoting, but it did digest very quickly. When you think about soil temperatures in August, there was an amazingly rapid digestion of a huge amount of biomass, and we grew some of the best corn we have ever grown. Well, I should say, we did grow the best corn we've ever grown on the farm in that field. One of the hybrids actually averaged over 225 bushels per acre. We've never had anything like that before. And that was with limited inputs other than that huge amount of cover crop biomass that we had, cover crop including cash crop biomass. Do you have a question? In that particular situation, we drilled it. Okay, so the question was, why did our no-till bean crop fail? I think the simplest explanation, since we had some of our no-till beans succeed and some of them fail, and the clear dividing line was where we drilled, they failed that year, and where we planted, they succeeded. What had happened was that field had the best rye biomass. We were really excited. It wasn't actually one where we intended to do no-till, but we had grown pumpkins the previous year. Pumpkin residue releases a lot of nutrients. The rye grew very well, and so I thought this is going to be a field where we can do even more no-till soybeans than we had planned. And sometimes second-guessing your plan like that fails. And what happened was the rye was pulling a lot of moisture out of the soil right when we were planting. When you let rye grow all the way to head, it's pulling a lot of moisture quickly. And so we didn't have good moisture in the top 2 inches. With the drill, it's very difficult to get consistent placement of seed depth. And so the planter, we were able to, put the, with various rye conditions, we were able to easily adjust the planter to always place the seed into moisture. With the drill, we actually set the drill as deep as the 750 drill could go. And it still did not consistently set the seed in moisture. And so we had a very erratic stand. And you will never have success in organic no-till if you don't have a good stand of soybeans. Yeah, we did crimp it. Yeah, we did most everything the same other than the planting on 30-inch rows versus drilling on 7.5-inch rows. Of course, with the 30-inch rows, we were also able to do some high residue cultivation. Okay. Speaking of no-till beans, I think you guys have already probably thought plenty about no-till during this meeting if you've been here since Thursday, but one of the basic messages that I want to leave about our experience with no-till is if you're not willing to adjust your rotation to maximize the establishment of your cereal rye, or we've also had success with triticale, then you shouldn't try this system. Trying to plant rye or triticale after corn will work some years, and other years it will be very difficult to get the quality of stand that you consistently need. And I guess this is, there was something I was going to put in the presentation earlier, but I guess I forgot about it. Many, many years ago, when I first started thinking about organics, I read a book by Jim Bender. Does anybody know that name, Jim Bender? Jim Bender is I don't know if he's even still farming, but he was a pioneering organic farmer out in Nebraska. And he had a section of the book, and I read this now probably at least 25 years ago, but there was a section that I will always remember. He talked about the difference between trying to maximize the maximums and minimize the minimums. And the basic idea is risk management is really important, especially in our lower input systems. When we don't have all these types of conventional inputs, rather than trying to swing for the fences, we should be really trying to make sure that we don't have failures. And my experience with the no-till system is it has worked very well many years, the majority of years, but we have also had some catastrophic failures where it has not worked at all. And half of our no-till didn't work at all in 2017, and then nearly all of our no-till didn't work in 2018. In both cases, it was a moisture issue where we did not get the beans established well because of very, very dry conditions. Anyway, back to thinking about how to make sure that you get a good stand of rye or whatever your cover crop is. What we found is if we have corn followed by a small grain, could be field pea, could be a mix of oats and peas, which is something that we're doing now. After you harvest that small grain, you have plenty of time to establish your rye or your triticale. You can have a bare fallow period if you want in between so that you really control perennial weeds. You have time to grow some nitrogen if you want. You could have frost seeded red clover. Various things align so that you can get the very best stand of your cover crop possible. And then, while you still can have challenges, like this past season when it was so dry that we just did not get the soybeans established, even though we had a very, very good stand of rye and triticale, if you don't succeed in getting that good stand of rye or triticale established to start with, I think you should pull the plug immediately. You should not proceed with trying to do no-till. Okay. Okay. Yep. So just to wrap up here, a couple more kind of key concepts, and then I'll just show a bunch of pictures real quick. In terms of a basic concept, I'm trying to grow strategic sequences of crops and cover crops to maximize a positive cycle of root zone improvement. That's kind of a mouthful of words, but that's what I'm trying to do in terms of the agronomy. Now, obviously the marketing has to be part of this as well, but that's kind of my underlying goal. And there are other things that you can do to improve root function, but that green box shows you what is kind of my top priority in terms of thinking about the agronomy of crop sequences. Okay? There are all sorts of things that are being discovered these days about how ecology can work for you. And you know, this is a fancy word, eco-functional intensification, but the basic idea is we can put together ecological systems in a way that they are organized. They're structured to work for you. And there's lots of interesting literature on this, research literature, but there are also people who, without knowing any of the scientific details, are just putting together these biodiverse systems that are working better because of their diversity. But not just the diversity, because of the organization of the diversity. Okay, so frost-seeded red clover is a tried and true system. We still use some of this, but as we try to increase eco-functional intensification, we are doing more of this, okay, where we're putting multiple species together, and this is not an option unless you have a small grain or something that's harvested very early in the season that allows you the growing season to grow this. Okay, in this case, we actually went in with this vertical tillage tool with an air delivery system, and we planted rye into that diverse cover crop mix. And we were able to use only, in this case, we actually only used 12 pounds of rye and grew more rye biomass than where we planted 1.5 bushels. That very small amount of seed, every plant grew really, really well into that environment. Okay, here's a situation where we had rye that volunteered after a no-till experiment, and there were only maybe 1 or 2 rye plants per square foot, but that was enough that when I supplemented it with oats, peas, and mustard, I had an excellent mix of, you know, the overwintering cover plus the spring planted covers. I got a mix that preceded pumpkins very well. Okay, we're growing peas and oats together. I wouldn't say we've perfected this system, but we have a buyer, and obviously That's what you need for something like this. We have a buyer, a dairyman, that wants to buy oats and peas together. So we're growing it together, and we're gaining economically, but we're also, I think, gaining ecologically. Okay, just to wrap up, the other thing that we're making progress on is figuring out how to interseed into young corn. So this is our first work with early interseeding into V5 corn. You can see we're using a little teeny drill there planting cowpea, and we had no yield loss for the corn, and we grew a significant amount of cowpea biomass. This is our last season, 2018. So this was 2017. Here we have 2018. We actually compared growing the cowpea under the canopy of a 30-inch row or of 30-inch row corn versus 60-inch row corn. And obviously, as you can see there, we grew a tremendous amount of cowpea biomass. We approximately increased the cowpea biomass by 10 times by expanding the amount of light that was getting into it. We did lose 20% of our corn yield. I don't think the 60-inch row system is the ideal system, but I think there are probably options for reducing the number of corn rows. So one thing we're going to look at next year is 2 rows of corn, skip row, 2 rows of 30-inch corn, skip row, and then we might even look at some wider strips. But we still will have these windows, what are sometimes called solar corridors, and I think we'll be able to grow a lot more cover crop biomass. We will also have higher populations or tighter in-row spacing. So on our 60-inch row corn, we grew 150 bushel corn with the corn plants 3 inches apart. The weed control was fantastic. I mean, it was really easy to control weeds when you have your corn plants 3 inches apart. Obviously, there are going to be limits to just how well a corn plant can grow with its neighbors that close. And so what I'm thinking is if we just skip out maybe a third of the rows or a fourth of the rows rather than half of the rows, we can benefit from the higher population, but also have a little more space for the corn plant. So just to wrap up, I guess the bottom line is there are all sorts of interesting possibilities. We need to be creative. We need to let the numbers inform us, whether it be the market opportunity numbers, or in this case, while this was really exciting, it under-yielded by 20%. So, if we were able to graze that cowpea biomass, maybe that 20% yield loss would work. For us, I'd like to get that down to no significant yield loss or 5% yield loss with a lot more cover crop biomass. I think that's pretty exciting. Anyway, thank you guys.